Okay, let's talk about other D3 scales. So you have already seen some of the scales that we have been using in our charts, but there are way many more. And there are a lot of things that change in between those scales. So I recommend you taking a look at this collection that you can find in the Observable website inside the D3 account, searching for D3 scale. If you take a look at the introduction that Phil created on that, it's actually quite nice. You see, like the basic one is D3 scale linear, that you define the domain, the range, as we have seen already. He also presents the non-numeric scales. Remember that scale ordinal is one where instead of passing two numbers, like as you do in the domain and range of a scale linear, what you do in here is that you actually pass a set of elements. So here you have 3 elements and it's going to be mapped one by one to each one of them. So for instance, dog is going to be return 13 as you see here. The other thing that you can do is that you can actually pass the domain and the range as you see here as the parameter of scale ordinal, or if you just pass the first one, that is going to be your range, and that's what we have been doing with colors. So the other nice thing about scale ordinal is that you don't need to pass the domain, so it will start guessing them depending on what order you return. So for instance, in this case, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and it's going to start repeating those in there. Apart from that, the other cool thing is that, for instance, if you pass 2 colors to it, then D3 is going to try to interpolate in between them. Be careful though that if you do this, it's not going to be perceptually correct, so that's something to keep in mind. The other thing is that what I mentioned before, and this is actually a great example of that, is that if you're representing areas, remember that you should be using scale square root instead of scale linear. Because if you use scale linear, notice how different it is. So it's actually is over exaggerating rather the big values as you do with this, because remember that what usually you're changing with that is the radius and not the area. So and the area it's the square value of the radius. So that's for those. If you're going to be using scale ordinal, you already saw how to use it in shapes in here. You also can use a scale band and scalePoint. Scale band is the one that you use for creating, for instance, bar charts. So the idea with a scale band, like something like this, with a scale band is that you send as the domain a group of elements, and then for the range, you just pass two values, and then what it is going to do is distribute the numbers across that domain to have equal values. Remember that you also get a bandwidth with that. The other one is a scalePoint that does pretty much the same thing, with the difference that it's assuming that each element is going to be in one specific point, so that way you can create charts like this. And then you also have to take into account that you have a padding and also a rounding that is going to help you getting and setting your values. So keep those in mind as well. The other one that I want you to see is in scaleTime. Is quite useful for operating with dates. Basically, it's the same thing that a scale linear, but when you create an axis, it's quite clever at choosing whatever attribute corresponds. It better assumes to that. So for instance, in here, it shows time, like hours, and then dates every time it changes. You should take a look at the full notebook to get more information about it. Especially this can get you dizzy, but it's quite clever, especially that if you are using time zones, there's another alternative that is using D3 scale UTC that is quite useful for that as well. Coming back in here, the other one that is really nice is using Quantize and Threshold. So these scales, like usually, for instance, imagine that you're trying to show these numbers. If you represent them each one by a square, as you see here, if you use scale linear, then you're going to see something like this, which is good for letting you compare each one of the actual values in between them. but it's not so good for identifying groups of values. So if you use something like a scale threshold, and scale threshold, you pass the minimum and the maximum, and then you pass a set of what are the values that you have in between, then it's going to group, and then you can see like by ranges. So whatever you see in here, so it's pretty much dividing them in blocks, like it's a step scale. So whereas linear, it's going to be something like this. Threshold is going to divide them like this, just separating them in this way. Quantize, it's also very similar. It's going to be also passing like what it's like the possible values from 0 to the maximum. Quantile, it's pretty much the same, but instead of passing the range of the values, you pass all of the possible values. So take a look at that. The only way of actually learning those, it's by playing with them. And then there is a ton of other examples in here that you should be taking a look at, especially for color scales and divergent scales. There are many different ones that you can use for different purposes in D3.